Hello, everyone. I am Amy Souza. You are watching my Known Heretic channel. And today I am going live with Candice Jackson. We have spoken in Twitter Spaces, and I've had the opportunity to talk with her there, but I'm super excited to have her here on my channel. Candice is working right now with Wolf on California prison reform. She brings with her a background as the acting assistant secretary for civil rights and then the deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education. She developed the first ever sexual harassment and sexual assault regulations under Title IX. And I'm so excited to have her here today to tell us a little bit more, about Title IX, tell us what is going on in the women's prisons today. I want to talk about some other extrapolations of what we're seeing in how Title IX is now being used actually against, I would say, women and kids. And yeah, I want to bring a little bit more understanding to that. But first, I just want to welcome you, Candice. Thank you so much for being here. And I also kind of want to ground us in this conversation with, I've seen you in my spaces. You have been on my radar for a while, but how did you come to kind of get in with the gender criticals and the feminists? How did you come to work with Wolf, and ultimately, what activated you into this topic?
Yeah, well, I think and thank you so much for having me on. This is really wonderful to get to have an in-depth conversation with you. For me, I think like a lot of us, now credit due. There are many feminists and women who have been aware of this for a decade or more. But I was one of the ones that frankly, as a lesbian, as becoming a parent 9 years ago, I was pretty settled for quite a while, thinking that LGBT was, doing its thing. We got marriage equality. Things were pretty good in terms of civil rights. And it took me by surprise by 2016 to realize something weird is going on here. We are manufacturing a problem that from my vantage point didn't really exist. And then that was such an interesting time because it got very spotting that issue, especially on the right, became very tricky. And
Yep.
Full disclosure, I've always been politically right of center. I've always been an economic libertarian type, kind of very skeptical of government's ability to solve all problems and so forth. And it was very difficult for, I think, the issue of realizing that this was not just the next iteration of progressivism, that this wasn't just more intense identity politics coming from the left. This was shifting and jumping into a completely different concept that challenged whether we were even going to have political discussions grounded in reality anymore. And that's when I started noticing that this was, interestingly, not a left-right issue at all. There were just as many people, lifelong dedicated left-wingers, as anybody else who were saying, wait a minute, this is not the left-wing progressive platform that I've ever known or supported. I thought we were all supposed to be very concerned about women's rights and about the rights of gay and lesbian people. And all of a sudden, negative consequences were popping up, but we were all supposed to just not care about it because it was all in the name of the next frontier of civil rights, the next group of minority rights. So around that 2016, 2017 period, Donald Trump wins the election. I had been involved in that campaign. And so then had the opportunity to serve in directing civil rights law and policy in the education department. And that's where it really started, the rubber hitting the road for me is, Wolf came in and met with me as the stakeholders, but not alone. They came in paired with a very right-wing religious group, Alliance Defending Freedom. And that's when it caught my attention. Wow, something is really happening here where groups like these are partnering up to come, talk to government officials and express their shared concerns. They're willing to set aside every other difference they have, abortion and everything else. They're willing to set it aside to say, this is not okay for women, for truth, for reality, for kids. So that's when it started to catch on for me that there is something happening to the very concept of what it means to not discriminate against groups, and the very concept of what it means to treat groups equally under the law.
Yeah. Yeah. So what was then your so okay, well, first of all, I guess my question is, as you were working, with the Department of Education, as you were working on those Title IX issues, what were you so that's when you were starting to see this come up, but what were you specifically working on? Because I know you were working on cases that had to do with sexual harassment and assault, and so I guess that question, and I don't know if maybe you want to lead into that by maybe even going a little bit into the specifics of Title IX, because I think women and maybe all of us, not just women, of course, women and men, having this conversation are still a little confused, because I think that we think it's a bill that specifically has to do with women and girls. I always hear like, oh, we made this bill for women and girls, to have sports and spaces. But it's not exactly that. So can you parse that out for us a little bit?
So Title IX is the educational amendments of 1972. And when you think about what was going on, and that's 50 years ago this year, right? This next month. And it was in an era where in the realm of all things education, there was still a lot of stereotyping of girls and women. There was outright exclusion of girls and women from even being admitted to certain programs, or maybe the curricula would be designed like girls are going to study this, boys are going to study that. Girls were not succeeding in any way in sports or anything else, because even if the program, the team was technically open, good luck, it's very, very rare that a girl would make the team, right? So all of that definitely motivated passing a non-discrimination based on sex bill. But as you point out, U.S. law in terms of equality law and non-discrimination law heavily has always favored what you could call blindness to the characteristic. So we're very skeptical of concretizing or even legally recognizing that we need this kind of non-discrimination law, because the minority characteristic is being oppressed or marginalized by the majority characteristic. And so when we pass a non-discrimination law, it is intended to help the minority characteristic, but that's not what the law says. The law says we're going to protect and force equal treatment regardless of this characteristic. Everybody has a sex. And the law and Title IX says don't exclude people or deny them the benefits or subject them to discrimination, not on the basis of being a woman, but on the basis of sex.
Yeah.
And so, yes, it's always been motivated by recognizing that it's almost always females that have gotten the short end of the stick and need an equality standard so that we can have the ability to have opportunities equal to those that men have always enjoyed. But the law stands for both men and women, in the sense that the general rule becomes treat everybody the same regardless of their sex. Now, if you think about it, that kind of blindness doesn't work out for women very well when it comes to sex. Because if even a law that says treat everybody the same, women are still going to get the short end of the stick in a lot of areas because of the basic inescapable differences between men and women. Not talking about stereotypes, just basic physical and physiological, differences between the two sexes. And so that's where Title IX has this general, don't discriminate, treat everybody the same, and yet has lots and lots and lots of exceptions built in where schools are allowed to divide boys and girls up. They're supposed to provide things comparable for each sex, but they can do that, but they can provide them separately, like sports, like intimate facilities, like sexual health classes, PE classes, lots of exceptions built in there in an implied recognition that the dignity, the ability of women to truly have equal achievement in an area, or to truly be as safe and secure, or preserve their bodily and mental dignity, often in lots of circumstances requires different treatment that's, comparable to each other, but separate.
Now, and
that's where now the if you try to add gender identity into that, it erases the ability of the law to keep those exceptions in place.
Yeah. So, and that's kind of exactly where I want to go. So I'm glad that you're bringing this into it, because ultimately, one, does Title IX does specifically talk about sex, but it doesn't explicitly define it. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true.
I mean, because of course in 1972,
it was so assumed that
it was obvious.
That's right.
So they would have been redundant.
Yeah. Title IX was 1972. The Civil Rights Act, massive piece of equality legislation, had just occurred in 1964. And it too mentions sex, and again was not defined because nobody needed to define it. It was obvious that we were talking about whether you're male or female, but that never had to be defined.
And so can you speak to how Biden's EO, in a sense, rewrites or redirects the, I guess, imperatives of Title IX?
So day one of Biden's administration, he passes this executive order that directs all his federal agencies to go back to the drawing board and do everything you can to make sure that existing laws, so that they can avoid having to pass new ones and have a democratic debate about this. Can you do everything you can to make sure that existing laws can be applied to just cover gender identity discrimination? And so last summer, the Department of Education issued a formal notice of interpretation of Title IX. Again, you can issue that without going through any kind of public feedback process. And their new interpretation of Title IX, without changing a single word in the statute, without changing a single word in the regulations that are under Title IX, just reinterprets the whole thing to now include gender identity discrimination. Theoretically, that's livable, and because, for example, when writing up sexual harassment regulations under Title IX, we actually didn't feel compelled to distinguish or to try to define sex at that point. And that was because when it comes to something like being a victim of or a perpetrator of sexual harassment, that can happen regardless of your sex, regardless of your sexual orientation, and whatever gender identity is, without regard to any personal identity belief that you have. So in some areas, you can live with saying don't discriminate against somebody based on their gender identity, even though that's not a coherent term. It's not a real characteristic. It's not based in materiality. But all it's really saying at that level is don't be punitive to somebody because they believe this about themselves. Here's what happens though. The way that they're interpreting discrimination is the problem, because they're now saying it's discrimination not to honor your subjective belief about yourself and treat you according to your subjective belief about yourself and ignore the objective sex class that you fall into. That's what's destroying everything.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's really insane. And also, what kind of kills me is, why would this specific kind of identity be more recognized than another kind of identity, like my I don't know, my religious identity, or my, I don't know, my astrological identity.
Yeah.
Why don't I get
Or right, or the analogies that cross my mind are because what's going on here is you're saying my subjective identity changes or determines an objective characteristic, right?
Yeah.
And so why don't we all have age identities? There's no
Yeah.
reason under the philosophy, under the concept of gender identity, there's zero reason at all why we don't embrace having an age identity and say, I was assigned a date at birth that I don't identify with.
Reject it. I also reject it.
Yeah. So, but there's no principled reason,
Yeah.
because there is zero limitation. There's no limiting principle in the very concept of gender identity that would stop self-identity as to any other characteristic that conflicts with the objective fact of what you are.
Well, and the other thing that kind of gets to me now, so I way back in, right when after it passed in March, I participated with a group of other women, including Kara Dansky, and we did a big rally. Basically, we held a rally in Washington D.C. to say, we don't consent to this, we reject it. The thing that kills me, so I was reading through that EO a bunch at the time, and there was no, that word gender identity is not even clearly defined within that executive order, except in a very tautological way. So I mean, as you said, it got to skip any legal scrutiny, because I think if you held it up just as it is currently written, it collapses on itself, because it's simply a tautological thing. I mean, I think it literally says, your gender identity is like the identity that you think your gender is. I mean, it literally is like just a little
that
circle.
bad, yeah. Nobody ever defines gender.
Yeah.
Nobody ever defines identity. Nobody ever defines sex is this and gender identity is that. It's very circular, like you're saying, tautological. We're expected to think that apparently gender identity is different from sex, apparently, and yet the result is always your gender identity actually changes your sex, because you're supposed to be now treated as male, female, both, or neither, in accordance with your identity. So to be fair to the Biden administration, nobody can define gender identity in a non-circular way. So if you're going to try to incorporate it into a law, which I would maintain there's zero reason to do and is absurd, but if you were going to, the only category for it to ever fit into is to call it out as a particular spiritual belief that is going to be in the same treatment as we give to religious liberty. And which again comes down to, don't be punitive to somebody, in a public system, right? Churches can, band together and exclude people who don't share their own belief. That's fine. But in a public arena, public school, employment that is supposed to be neutral, that kind of thing. Don't penalize somebody for what they believe. It's a spiritual, deep-seated inner identity belief, we're told. Fine, that's great. Hold on to that. And we even give some religious liberty protections for practicing your belief. But we draw lines around that. That is only when it's reasonable. That is only when it doesn't intrude on everybody else's right to believe or not believe something. Yep. So that would be, potentially a framework for how to fairly, justly treat people in society these days who hold this very sincere belief about themselves that contradicts facts.
I know. And the kind of other insanity piece. I mean, there's a lot of insanity pieces in this to me. But I think one of the other insanity pieces is that there are hundreds and hundreds of these identities, with new ones being manufactured all
Mhm.
the time. Like, I was watching a bunch of TikToks recently about cake identity. So that's a new
Yeah.
thing. I've been watching ones with
Now, they want you to understand that it's
mm,
not that they believe themselves to be a cake. It's that
yeah.
the gender is light and fluffy like a cake. That is
And
something that
layered.
the law should definitely get in there and
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. Or these animal
yeah,
identities, and the partial identities, the
yeah,
demi boy and the demi girl and the nutrigender,
yeah,
and or the DID kids now who think they have multiple personalities, and then those personalities
are
have
all yeah,
different genders. I was
yeah,
reading one with a girl who, a young girl who says one of her identities is as a man who is a trans woman, and this identity, should she call herself a trans woman because this identity. I mean, it's absolute insanity.
yeah.
So, I mean, how can we possibly, quote unquote, even if we, I don't know. I mean, how could we possibly protect for this ever changing, ever expansive
Yeah.
religion that
But
is being created in front of our eyes
yeah,
as we go?
the only way we can do it is to be willing to take a step back and again affirm and recognize that there are facts, there's an objective reality, a material reality, and believing something that has no basis in reality can be protected in terms of, again, don't be punitive just because somebody believes it. But here's the
Yeah.
thing with religious liberty, we've always been able to do this, not always perfectly. We can all argue about whether we always draw the lines perfectly, but the concept is sound, and that is that religious belief does not necessarily exempt you from general rules that have a rational basis, an objective foundation. And that's why, you may have a very sincere religious belief that you need to sacrifice animals in order to gain salvation for your soul. That may be very grounded in your history and your traditions and in your heart. You believe that you need to do this in order to be in order for your eternal soul to be saved. Does not mean we've decided that the government and society cannot step in and say, nope, we're not going to allow animal cruelty, even though
Yeah.
you say that you genuinely want to do it to practice your religion. So there are general rules that
Yeah.
that will be followed, even if that means somebody can't fully practice their religion. And that's where it happens here. You can believe you're a cat, but you still need to be held to human standards and laws. Or you can believe
I don't want you taking
you can
crap in public.
that's
Please
right.
don't do that.
You're going to still be held to the human standards. And same thing with sex. Your sex is what it is. And when we have reasonable laws that divide up people based on their sex, you can
Yeah.
believe what you want, and you should not face harassment or bullying or being targeted as you're such a horrible person for believing that your sex is other than what it is. But you're still going to have to follow the general rational rules of society that do separate people based on sex. That's the
Yeah.
only framework that works for any of this. It's when the California prison law came out, I thought for sure that this would help really open people's eyes to how unworkable this is in law, because it was one of the first times that that in a very specific setting like prison life, the law went beyond, just completely rejected the very notion of a binary going on. Because it's one thing, you can fight on one level about saying sex is sex. We all know what it is. There's only two types, male and female. And are we willing to do anything to accommodate people who believe that they got it wrong and really want to switch? That's one conversation.
Yeah.
But what a law like this does is not only view cross-sex identity as something that should be taken at face value, and if you've got a cross-sex identity, we'll move you from male to female, but it tries to put into law the notion of every other type of, like you're describing, identity, and it tries to write that into law. So this right to choose which prison you go to, women's or men's, applies whether you claim a transgender identity, a non-binary identity, or an intersex identity, which is a whole separate stupid issue. How is that identity to begin with?
So you can claim a physical condition that you don't have?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But when you look at the way the law then tries to define transgender and non-binary, it should be so embarrassing that we have laws that are actually writing in terms like genderqueer and gender fluid and two-spirit, and I mean they try to give like a non-exhaustive list of everything that it means, because it just comes down to I don't identify as my sex. I mean that's just.
Well, and can we talk about how this functions in practice? Because obviously, women, I guess, also have the freedom
Yeah.
to claim whatever identity they want, but that there is no protection in that. They can claim to be whatever they want, but ultimately there is nowhere for them to move now that is away from men. They can claim to be two-spirit also. Where is their special provision? Because ultimately these men are getting a special provision, and based on what I it's again still undefinable. And for me it's like, if we need men's prison reform, we should do that. Maybe small men are vulnerable, and weak men, and young men, and pretty men, and disabled men. There's a lot of vulnerable men in men's prisons, and men commit 99% according to the FBI and the MOJ, over 99% of all rapes are committed by men. So of course men are going to be vulnerable to rape in men's prison. But it's like if some men are extra vulnerable in men's prison, why is it the responsibility of the women's prison to house them based on an identity claim that is absolutely undefinable in terms of material reality?
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's a good example of the way that gender ideology activists try to have it both ways. They both want society to retain sex categories, and yet they also want, in practicality, to destroy sex categories, because, like you point out, women's prison is no longer a women's prison. It's a prison full of supposedly vulnerable, male people and all the female people. So
it's now mixed sex. It's mixed sex.
No,
However,
it is a mixed sex prison. And you're right that even though the law gives the same right to female prisoners, in practicality, the men's prison is still a male-only institution, because even though in California, I think about 6 applications have been made by females who trans-identify, none have been granted. Why do you think that is? Obviously, the system knows that whatever the law says, they cannot put a female person smack dab in the middle of a men's prison. You just can't do it. And yet you've got, dozens of males who have already been transferred over into
I
California women's prisons, and 300 more
I
who
was
have
just gonna
applied.
say. And
And
I heard that of the men who have applied, none have yet been denied.
that's correct. Yes. All the
They
applications.
all haven't been transferred, but none have been denied
That's
so
correct.
far.
Yep. Yep. And
Why
when you think about it,
why are we assuming some sort of like guilelessness? Like why do we assume, like, already we know these are criminals, we know they're willing to lie, we know they're willing to
yeah.
cheat, we know they're willing to steal, we know they're willing to rape. Why do we make some sort of assumption that they are in earnest?
Yeah.
Why are we giving them the assumption of I don't
Well,
know.
that's part of why we raised in this lawsuit, and I think it's the first time in the U.S. that this has been put forward in a lawsuit, and it's an uphill legal battle, but it has to start being explored this way. That's why we are making a First Amendment Establishment Clause argument, because we're saying there is no rational secular reason to premise a law on something like this other than pure belief, pure faith that gender identity is some magical special thing that transcends all human characteristics and inclinations and human motives and everything. There's no basis to believe that. It is a pure faith doctrine. And so for the state to create and implement a law premised on that kind of faith, arguably that should constitute establishment of a state sanctioned religion, or a belief
Yeah.
system that is functioning as a religion, and the state is promoting it and acting upon it, and we're not supposed to do that.
Now, are you, when you go into this, will you be able to reference what's happening in other states? Because I know I've read about in New Jersey, I've read about in Washington, in
Yeah.
California, in I think it also exists in New York. Wherever it exists,
Yeah.
women have been raped. So wherever this exists, women are already suffering. So are you able to use what's happening in other states when you're bringing this up against the state of California?
That we are certainly going to try, and the evidentiary rules and the procedural niceties of court leave it a little bit up in the air, to what extent what's going on in other states will be deemed officially irrelevant. But we're certainly planning on making that point. Yeah, that this is not unique to California. This is going to happen wherever people are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's just, I mean it's just like, to me it's just the absolute like little like old image of the see nothing, hear no evil,
Yeah,
see no evil, speak no evil of those little monkeys. Like
yeah,
I just have to believe that legislators who are putting this into place are just willfully blind. And that's one of my other questions, like what what I mean, just honestly, like, what do you think these legislators are thinking? Like, to me, any rational person would say, I do not trust I don't trust a serial rapist just on his own word to believe that he is now, some sort of woman identity, even if I believe that such a thing existed. Like, why do I take him in good faith? So are I don't know. Do you think these politicians are trying to please their constituents? Who are they trying to please by these bills? Because obviously, the incarcerated women, that they're just literally sitting ducks. They're sitting victims trapped in cells with their victimizers. I mean,
yeah.
it's insane to me, and I think it's insane to any thinking person. But what could possibly be going on in their heads? I don't know if you have an answer
I
to
mean,
that.
it's all a theory, right? Because but what it what it seems like to me is that the legislators, not all of them who cast a vote, there's a huge middle going on, not only among, legislators and officials, but just among the general public. There's a huge middle that is just ignorantly supporting the current trend. But the ones who push this, the ones who are the core small group that fight for this and will die on this hill for this ideology, it is striking how much like cultish religious zealotry it is, because from that framework, everything they do is divinely good, with a capital G, good. And it does not matter what earthly consequences happen to be. The spiritual, the divine pursuit of liberation, and they are fighting for on a higher plane is how that feels. And it's the same thing that I think has allowed there's a reason we separate church and state, because when you give a religious doctrine full reins of power over civil government power, you are not going to be in a system where you are rationally debating the material consequences of policies and laws. You are going to be doing certain things because that is God's will. And that is a directive that it does not matter what the material earthly consequences are. We will do this because it is God's will. And here, to me, what genderism does is flip that concept. You don't see the adherents of this ideology professing belief in a monotheistic God that, whose will we're following. But you know what? You are seeing what happens is that every single believer in gender identity becomes God. And your identity becomes the ultimate will that must be followed by you and by every other person in the world.
Yeah.
But think about how weird that is, because you're talking then about 8 billion gods, right? Whatever each person's identity is must be worshipped, must be promoted, everything must bend to make sure that each person's inner will is followed. It's bizarre.
It is bizarre. And the other thing that gets me about prisons, because I mean, there are women's prisons, first of all, are a much different establishment than men's prisons, and there are actually children there, because I know incarcerated women are allowed to keep their children. Is it up to 4 years, 3 years, 4 years?
I'm actually not sure what the mother-child unit length of time is in California. It's not long enough.
No, it's not. It's absolutely not long enough. But this is just to say, like, there are children, in these facilities, and how can we conscience allowing serial rapists and pedophiles, known pedophiles, to go to these places?
Yeah. I think the other important practical consequence to keep in mind is the reality of rape is horrible. But when you think about the dynamics that go on in prison, there are both women and men who are in there for life and therefore deprived of any sexual interaction. And most people statistically are heterosexual. So it is only to be expected that even setting aside non-consensual or violent sex, rape, even setting rape aside, sex is going to happen. And when you look at what that means in the prison context and how that falls on women and only women in terms of pregnancy, and then what do you do with a pregnancy in prison? You then have a choice, and maybe you're pressured in your choice. State-funded abortion, try to have the child, the baby that's going to be ripped away from you pretty quickly. It is not cool at all. That's one of the many reasons why we sex separate prisons to begin with. How in the world can the government officially endorse and promote and support sex and pregnancy in prison, even setting aside rape? It's horrendous.
Yeah. It's really sad. Oh my God. Um, you know,
Which is why, by the way, I mean, a law like this that came into effect in California in 2021, for years before that, without it being a law, the prison system did have kind of unofficial policies of making case by case exceptions and going ahead and placing certain men, transgender identified men over into women's prisons. It was not terribly common, but it did
mhm,
happen. So
mhm.
there have always been a handful of these guys over there.
Yeah.
But because the prison system was at least able to take into account obvious factors like, sorry to be so blunt, but obvious factors like, do you have a working penis?
Yeah.
I mean, they could at least take into account factors that would look at somebody individually and say, "Oh, wait a minute, you have not only criminal history but a prison discipline history of violence or of
Yeah.
sexual assault." You could look at those kinds of factors. You could look at whether somebody is feminine and wispy versus bulky and huge and dominating. You can look at their mental stability. You could look at, again, maybe most importantly, a functioning penis and the ability to, to rape in that way and cause pregnancy if you're living among women. And this law, even if it was limited only to men who claim a woman identity, which it's not, but even if it was, it specifically tells the prison system you're not allowed to consider any of that. All of that is off the table. I mean, they do. It's like they sat back and looked for a way to make this as appalling for women as possible. You are required under this law, the prison system is, to ignore physical characteristics, sexual orientation, anatomy, and they describe it in a way that ends up, and then another category is described in a way that ends up meaning, and you can't take into account anybody's offense history or prison discipline history or mental health.
And I heard you speaking about this. I can't remember where I heard you speaking about this, but going into the part of, I mean, that this it's so unbelievable, but going into the part of the law where it was like, if these conditions exist in the current facility, then you can't factor it out. So, like, if mental health conditions exist in the women's facility, if violence exists in the women's facility, can you explain that clause a little bit more?
Yeah, that's why the groups defending this law, back that interpretation up. The law language itself is worded very broadly. It just says, other than anatomy and physical characteristics and sexual orientation, you also can't consider any factors about the person that wants to transfer if those factors are also already present in the facility they want to transfer to.
That is so
Very
insane.
vague. But what that means, and the way that we understand it is now the same way that the people who love this law and want more men transferred in understand it, is that you absolutely cannot deny a man transfer to women's prison based on a sexual assault history, based on a rape in prison history, based on an overall violence, either out of prison or in prison history. Because the law says if there are any women already imprisoned for any of those things, or that any of those things already apply to women, well, then that wouldn't be fair to hold that against the man who wants to transfer in.
Why are we thinking?
Obviously, what it ignores is the reality. You can have
It's
equally violent men and women. If you have a man and a woman who are equally violent in the sense of aggression or whatever, the physical differences between men and women mean that the man is capable of overpowering the woman.
Now, okay, is there any way that we would ever be able to go back and actually protect sex as a characteristic. Because, like, for example, why women are uniquely being subjected to pregnancy, to forced
Yes.
pregnancy. That is unique to our sex. No matter what happens to men in men's prison, no one is being
Yeah.
subjected to forcible pregnancy. I mean,
Yeah.
rape is bad, of course, but no one is being subjected to forcible pregnancy, and all of the risk factors that that entails,
Yep.
whether you choose to abort or choose to follow through with the pregnancy, both come with extreme
Right.
health risks. So I don't know, that I guess that's my curiosity. Can we ever come back around to the law and
Yeah.
actually legally protect sex as a characteristic?
And that is exactly why it's so important that Wolf decided to start litigation like this. It is the first of its kind in the country. There are a lot of lawsuits out there starting up around different manifestations of gender ideology being backed up in law. We have to attack this from every angle, but this is an interesting one to do it in because
Because if you
it's
win,
so
what will it protect? If you win
okay.
this suit,
This
what
isn't
will it be?
Yeah, this is what's interesting too. If we won, what we would be saying is this law is unconstitutional. You got to wipe it away. What that returns to in California is very, very much sex separated prisons with, like I was describing, a few case by case exceptions. That is
Yeah.
the status quo before this law. That is the best we can do in this lawsuit to say, let's get back to that status quo. And
Yeah.
again, at least that you have the argument of the prison is capable of avoiding the possibility of forced pregnancy because
Yeah.
they are able to look at whether there's a functioning penis and testes going on here.
Yeah. Because surely, I mean, obviously, men are a lot more challenging to deal with. So surely the
Yeah.
women's prison facilitators cannot want this either.
You know,
You
I've
know,
heard I've heard one theory talking off the record to a male who spent many years in prison, and it is an interesting theory that on the one hand, the prison system employees, by and large, of course, they know and see the problems that this is causing, and then counteracting that might be a little bit of financial motivation because it requires women's prisons now to hire a lot more male employees and guards who get to work a lot more overtime. And the way that works, they can make a lot of money and get more opportunities that way. So there's a lot going on in terms of
wow.
mixed motives. Why,
Wow.
even though prison officials and prison employees see the obvious problems with this, they're not necessarily saying that out loud yet. They say
You
it
know,
quietly and impliedly in the sense that the prison system itself in California confirms that it has been slow rolling implementation. That's why, you got a few dozen men who have transferred, but 300 whose applications have been stalled for close to a year. They
yeah.
know
Yeah.
that they
Yeah,
can't
they
do this
know.
safely for women. So they're slow rolling it. Except the ACLU has a point, which is the law doesn't give you the discretion to just choose to slow roll this. Yeah. So, but they know the problems this causes.
It just kills me because, as I was telling you before we started, and for those of you watching who don't know, I testified a few months ago. Washington State had this privacy bill that was up for our prisons, which was all about, like, it was framed in a way that it was important to keep the privacy of the prisoners safe, but really it was about keeping the identity of men who claim to be women safe. Anyway, but in this research that I was doing, I was looking into, our foremothers, into the suffragettes who were actually instrumental in women's prison reform in the first place, because way back when, there were just prisons. There were prisons, and men and women went to the prison. The American suffragettes were inspired by what the British suffragettes were doing. And I think it was like in 1823, Elizabeth Fry had this Gallows Act passed in the UK, creating single sex prisons for women, specifically based on her going into prisons and seeing what was happening to the incarcerated women, that they were subjected to rape and sexual harassment and abuse by men. And that the whole reason that this has been established abroad and here is specifically because women will face male violence when housed with men. So it's like, it just,
Yeah,
it just kills me that we're just ignoring the whole premise of why we have this in the first place.
But we've ignored that premise in an important way from the beginning. So after the first wave was successful in establishing the premise of single sex prisons, it did not take long before US judges started interpreting and applying no sex discrimination laws in a way that violated women's human right to a single sex, female only rehabilitation environment on the employment side. So we have never stood up for the right of women to be guarded by women. For example, we have always, because it would be sex discrimination against men, to not allow them choice of job to work in the women's prison.
To have that one job.
Yes. And so we have always, contrary to what the United Nations has always said, are women's human rights in prison, contrary to the premise of single sex prisons and female only environments for true rehabilitation and protection of women who need to rehabilitate like this, we've always made that exception. And that was before the whole gender movement started coming in and attacking this on a whole new and even worse level, because obviously it is one thing to deal with the male perpetrated abuse, and yes, occasionally even rape, that male guards can impose on women. That's bad enough, and it has always happened. There have always been some pregnancies in prison because of it. It was getting better. There was some attention paid to it, and but at least when you're dealing with employees who are supposedly trained and under strict expectations of behavior, etc., that's one thing. But obviously a pool of inmates, fellow offenders that you're now supposed to live with, is a whole different ballgame.
Well, and as you sort of are observing, this incarcerated women are already women who have suffered more sexual violence and more domestic violence than their unincarcerated counterparts. So they are already hyper vulnerable to this. So they are already hypersensitive to men in their environments, and if we really thought, I think we've long gone past the idea that prisons are even a place for reform. But if we really did value prisons as a place of reform, we would treat it more like a rape crisis shelter,
right.
And honor that these women should not be around men, because they have abuse triggers. They have a trauma triggers in response to men in general.
And to be fair, especially at the federal prison level, there was some pretty good work going on, I would say, in the last 20 years, up until the gender juggernaut destroyed everything. But for about 20 years, there was some really good work being done, especially at that federal level, on accepting the premise that men and women are different, and therefore what females need in a prison environment and toward rehabilitation is different in every way, from mental health to physical health to social and emotional environment and cultural and programs and etc. that can truly lead to rehabilitation. women prisoners' motives for rehabilitating can be very different from men's. The vulnerability that you feel in an all-women environment is obviously very different once it's a mixed sex environment. And then and then programs that were specifically starting to address the trauma and the sexual abuse and the domestic violence histories and experiences of women, and how that plays into the ability to rehabilitate and re-enter society. All of that was getting some decent attention. And I mean, this has just sidelined it now, because what is the point? You could have a program that is supposedly, designed for a need of women, but now that it's mixed sex, that's not a thing anymore. So it's just, yeah.
It's so upsetting. Can I shift us just for a moment, and we can always come back to prisons, because I'll never get bored of talking about women's rights, and in that sense. But I wanted to, since you are an expert in Title IX, I wanted to bring up these other cases that we're starting to see. And we just had this one in Wisconsin. This was just I don't know, a week or so ago.
Yeah.
With the 8th grade students. So 3 8th grade middle school boys are now, the school is attempting to sue them under Title IX as sexual harassment for, quote unquote, the crime of misgendering their fellow classmates who were going by they, them. These are 8th graders. These are what, 12-year-olds who are going to be sued for sexual harassment crimes, for basically accurately naming what their eyes see and their ears hear. So I guess I want to say, I mean, obviously I could go off on how insane that is and what is happening to these boys, but how in the hell are they using Title IX and claiming that Title IX is a justification for going after these kids?
Yeah, so good opportunity to explain what your rights are and should be under Title IX as a student, or as a parent looking out for their kid as a student, when it comes to sexual harassment or sexual assault. Because we finally issued regulations that make this all spelled out and binding on all schools that take any kind of federal money. What your rights are to look at what the definition of sexual harassment and sexual assault is. If you experience that, or if you know of anybody who does, anybody has the right to report it to the school, and the school has to take immediate action. And what the regulation system currently does is divide up the obligation of the school to immediately reach out to the alleged victim. And even without investigating, proving anything, you've got to have a one-on-one dialogue with that alleged victim and say, what do you think you might need that we can do for you? Would you like a no contact order? Would that help? Keep you guys separate? Do you need some counseling? Do you need some time off even from school? That happens in college a lot. So the school has to reach out to the alleged victim right away and provide those kinds of supportive measures. It's very separate from how and when the school punishes the alleged offender. So on the punishment side, the school investigates but cannot punish, suspend or expel somebody for sexual harassment or sexual assault. You can't punish until you've gone through an actual process, an actual spelled out fact-finding process. And so what's supposed to happen is, at most, if you think that sexual harassment has happened, you might keep the students separated from each other. You might counsel, the respondent and say, here's sexual harassment definition. Here's the kind of conduct that crosses the line. The expectation is that you will not do that. But you're not supposed to punish anybody unless the victim or their parent files a formal complaint under Title IX, and then the school is supposed to be neutral and say, okay, at this point, the victim wants us to move forward. So we are going to investigate. We're going to talk to each side. We're going to look at text messages or, whatever the evidence might be about what really happened and occurred between you. We're going to talk to some witnesses. We're going to gather the factual information. And then at the end of a process that you both have the right to be involved in with your parents, then we will decide, did sexual harassment occur? And if so, what kind of remedy for the victim and punishment for the offender is appropriate. So for the school to jump the gun and be the one that creates a Title IX problem, that procedurally is an issue to begin with. Because it's only supposed to be very rare circumstances, like very violent or repeat allegations of sexual assault, for example, that would give the legal right to the Title IX coordinator of the school to start an investigation over the wishes of the victim. So that's supposed to be very rare. And then the obvious thing is here that the definition of sexual harassment is not yet, except the Biden administration is jumping the gun, but the definition of sexual harassment for verbal interactions. You're not talking about teacher-student abuse, and you're not talking about physical sexual assault. When you're in the verbal realm, it has to be objectively offensive. It has to be pervasive. It has to be severe enough that a reasonable person looking at what's going on would say, yeah, free speech is great, but now it's crossed the line into legitimately preventing the victim from equally accessing their education. This is too much. This is a problem. You have a free speech right, and that's why the Supreme Court crafted the Title IX harassment definition the way that it did, and we used that in the regulations. You got to give some breathing room for free speech and free thought in a school environment. And so that's the main problem with what's going on here, is that, again, you're now calling it harassment to not agree with somebody or to state an objective, verifiable fact in front of somebody. I mean, the details of this case seem to be that the student who demands to be called they, them was very aggressive about it and was berating and yelling at everybody that you need to do this. And when one student was just, no, I don't want to do that. I don't get it. I don't know. Then three others apparently jumped in and defended, all of their free speech rights, not to use these pronouns. And so for the school to jump ahead of things like that and immediately treat that as harassment, that's the future of Title IX under gender ideology. It happens to be boys accused of sexual harassment in this Wisconsin situation. But what I have been foreseeing is that as soon as you do this and abuse the very concept of what sexual harassment means, even verbal harassment that really can and should be punished, it's obviously going to fall on women and anyone who believes in women's rights, because all of a sudden that's a great way to stamp out anybody speaking up, literally speaking, verbalizing a view about women's rights and how Title IX should be here to protect women and should be based on sex, and just saying those things, protesting and expressing disagreement with having to use the bathroom with a boy now, or with having to compete against a boy on your sports team. Those girls who dare say that, or their parents, are now going to self-censor and not do it, because you're going to get branded as a sexual harasser.
I know.
And that's with you. That can follow you from school to school and even after your school career if you have sexual harassment on your record.
I mean, it is absolutely insane. And the thing is, like, the thing that really kills me too is that, even if they do not go through with this particular lawsuit, it's already prohibitive. The
Oh,
fact
it's
that it
killing.
has
Yeah.
blown up is
Yeah.
is already prohibitive. And we've
And by the way,
already
the school isn't suing the boys. The school started a Title IX charge against them, so that's all internal to the school,
okay.
and it'll be within this under the school's disciplinary code that can result in suspension or expulsion. And then you've got on top of that, we just saw in the last couple of weeks, the new policies out in Virginia for one of their public school districts now adds malicious misgendering as
Malicious
Mhm.
misgendering.
Malicious misgendering is now officially listed in policy, alongside the level of offense that is on the same level as homicide,
Oh
as
my God.
uh-huh. Yeah, and so malicious misgendering is now
Oh
at
my
that,
God.
that high level of offense that if a child, a student is found to have maliciously misgendered, I mean, expulsion is like that.
Eh, I this is a tragedy. Obviously, as someone who has libertarian beliefs, this just must kill you, with how this is absolutely quenching our right to free speech and to name the reality that's
Yeah,
happening in front of our faces. And I've seen, I put up I made a video essay last week that was about what's going on in the schools. It had a lot to do with the teachers, but one of the other things that I covered are these bathroom signs that are going up, and they're happening all over, from elementary school to high school to colleges, and the bathroom signs are basically saying, if you see someone in the bathroom that you don't think should be there, don't make them feel uncomfortable, protect them, respect them, and to me it is counter to everything that I would ever teach a young girl about keeping herself safe. I would teach a girl, if you see someone who does not belong, scream, call for help, fight back, you know protect yourself. And now we're saying it's your obligation to make this person feel comfortable and make them feel safe,
yeah.
even
That
though
that
they
whole
are the ones.
that message, of everyone is exactly who they say they are is beyond dangerous, especially for kids, right? And that's, when we talk about what even my nobody knows what gender identity is, but
Yeah.
setting that aside for a moment, if you're going to say don't discriminate based on it, whatever it is,
Yeah.
what they're doing in schools is very, very much they're equating safeguarding with discrimination, because
Yes.
safeguarding measures inherently involve generalizations. It's not We don't separate girls from boys when people are changing their clothes because every boy will attack every girl. That's never been true. That's never been the reason for the separation.
No.
But we do it based on generalizations, right? And they're calling those generalizations discriminatory now. And that's where you get to the magic of inclusion.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about inclusion, of members who have never belonged in the category that is being separated out, that's not
Yeah.
inclusion. That's destroying the category and the reason that we have the category. So it's one thing to say, don't keep masculine girls out of the girls' bathroom.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
because that's
Yeah. Yeah.
inclusionary of all girls because the bathroom is for girls.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when you say it's exclusionary not to let a boy into the girls' locker room, that's not negatively, pejoratively exclusionary. That's rationally and necessarily exclusionary. Otherwise, you don't have the category to begin with. And
Well, and these things are being juxtaposed. I mean, it's like it's a political wedge. It's a sloganeering
yeah,
word. And it comes at the expense of boundaries. You can't have
absolutely. There are no boundaries
all
in
you
this.
cannot have all inclusive
Yeah,
and have boundaries.
that's right.
It's so insane. It's just the way these things are going, and it's so frustrating because it's just so frustrating because obviously, specifically women put years and years of work into creating
Yeah.
provisions like Title IX. And now here we are in this bizarre nightmare world where they are being used against us for
Yeah.
for exactly the opposite reason of
Yeah.
what they were intended. So
Well,
instead of having boundaries, now we have none, and we are a bigot. If we want them, we can be suspended and punished
yeah.
for wanting them and naming our reality.
Yeah. One of the things, when I step back and look at the insanity that's going on along those lines, one of the things that I realize is that what we're having to do now is truly a new wave of women's rights, in the sense that the first and second waves needed to and did almost exclusively focus on, at least in the legal realm, focus on strict equality. There were
Yeah.
so many areas of life and that women were just excluded from based on being women, that it
Yeah.
was truly a matter of ignore sex, treat us the
Yeah.
same, treat men and
Yeah.
women the same when it comes to voting, treat men and women the same when it comes to hiring for almost every job, treat
Yeah.
men and women exactly the same when it comes to who gets to go to military school,
Mhm.
and what took a backseat and was done in a quieter way and never got challenged, and I'll explain why. So we never had to defend it legally. What got done in the background was all of the work that set up, look, if women are now going to be treated equally to men to be admitted to this public institution, then we're going to make sure that we get our own bathrooms. When women are now admitted to this program or that school, we're now going to make sure that we get our own showers and locker rooms.
Yeah.
That was done, but it was done very impliedly, and we never had to justify it legally because men didn't bother to challenge it. What we're learning now is the
Because
weak.
it was obvious.
It was obvious, and it wasn't something men cared about
Yeah.
attacking. They didn't want what we were building for ourselves in that sense. They
Yeah.
had a problem, and their fight was with letting us into X, Y, or Z to begin with. Once we won
Yeah.
that battle, they didn't care to fight us on having a separate locker room. That was our thing. Why would they want to go into our locker room? It was like, haha,
Yeah.
look at you trying to play sports. Ugh. Right? What we're finding out now is the shaky ground that any of our women only things have ever sat on. Because the
Yeah.
minute that men think that they actually do want what we have, they're getting it. They're getting it legally, they're getting it socially. That's how weak women only things have ever had a foundation for. Because the second that men decide, you know what, that looks kind of nice over there in women's prison. Hey, you know what? I could do really well competing as a woman on this team. As soon as they decide that it is worth trying to get for themselves what has been women only, they're getting it. So our job now is truly a new wave of women's rights. I don't care if you call yourself feminist or not, but it is
Yeah.
about the rights of women, to be recognized as women in laws and policies and in society. And we need to do the work that we didn't have to do 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, which is analyze very carefully what is it that makes a situation necessary to separate out what women need as different from what men need, and why is that okay? What are the criteria that we're looking for to distinguish between treat men and women exactly the same versus no, women need certain things in order to have true equality, and sometimes, frankly, we need to move away from, every time women have something, men have to have the exact same thing. The needs aren't always the same.
Yeah. Well, and this is what confuses me about Title IX, for example, because the fact of the matter is the men's teams were always open teams. You sometimes even see you sometimes see women who are soccer stars playing as kickers on
Right.
male football teams. It's very, very rare, but there are sometimes women who are so good
Right.
that they do get hired for that one position, which is of course the only position they could play because they can't get tackled by a 300-pound dude. But just to say, um, that I guess is one of the points that is kind of frustrating and confusing, because the whole reason that women needed, I guess, equal, an equal amount of teams, it wasn't that we needed our own teams, is because we were not competitive on in men's sports. But the thing is that men's sports were always open, which kind of kills me. And
A lot of,
again, that
yeah.
sloganeering term of like, they're banned from sports. Well, no, they're not, because
No,
those
nobody's
teams were
banned.
always open. They
Right.
were always open to anyone of
Yeah.
any sex, which
Yeah.
means any quote gender. Those
Yeah.
are open teams. The only reason women's teams and
Yeah.
girls teams existed is because we were non-competitive. We couldn't compete.
Yeah. There were some that were formal, that used to long ago formally exclude women, but by and large that's absolutely right. Women could try out, girls could try out for
Mhm.
stuff, they just never made the team. And it's interesting, the parallels now, to saying, on the one hand, let's keep men's and women's as a distinct thing, but you're right, if we recognize that historically men's teams have generally been open, you would think that would be a pretty rational thing. All we'd have to do is more expressly recognize that again, that you don't. But there's a slight legal barrier. I mean, because again, most of our non-discrimination laws are very specific about, if you are going to separate based on the sex characteristic, it must be comparable. It must be reciprocal. It must go both ways. So we might have a little legal tweaking that we need to do in order to acknowledge that men can afford to have a mixed sex whatever. Women can't afford to have a mixed sex whatever. And that needs to be okay. That asymmetry needs to legally be okay. It's not technically okay right now, but that can be fixed if we have a plan and a goal of recognizing that that's absolutely the way to go in a lot of these areas.
Yeah.
Maybe there are some areas where where male needs to be limited to the male sex, and we can think about that. But many of these areas, it's not a threat to men to have it an open category or an open service. So yeah, that's a good way to go in the future. It will never persuade the gender ideologues, but we need to do it. We need to do it anyway, because there's no compromising with them. There is getting through to reasonable, common sense people, and that is a very common sense way to look at it all.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope that we can. And and this is why, I mean, and I think you're right. I think you don't have to call yourself a feminist or understand feminist analysis to care that women have these designated spaces, designated sports, and have ultimately the integrity and sovereignty of our bodies protected.
Yeah.
Even just privacy, or friggin' privacy, to change our tampons in
Yeah.
private. I think that it is, a no-brainer to thinking people. And, in if I ever, for myself, do talk about feminism, I try to go back to that language of liberation. Originally the movement was a liberation movement from physical reproductive exploitation and physical reproductive oppression. So it was always a material analysis of physical conditions, and it wasn't really about equality. I think that's a lot of what those second waivers did, was make it a legal equality movement. But ultimately, that's not what those liberationists were wanting. They weren't like, we want equality under the patriarchy. We want to kill just as often as men. We want to rape just as often as men. We want to be equal to men. It was never an equality movement. It was about a specific liberation from a specific kind of material oppression. And I think that is, again, regardless if you want to get into the feminist analysis of it, we do have to stick with a materialist
Yeah.
analysis of conditions,
Yeah.
because that is where we're stuck. We are stuck
Yeah.
in these material conditions that are different than the material conditions that men face.
That's right. And that's where the line is between, it's not bioessentialist to recognize
Yeah.
that the female material conditions and constraints, that there's one set of those that is imposed by reality and
Yeah.
evolution, and
Yeah.
there's a separate set of those that's always been imposed on women, by men, and by a social set of ideas. And so you can distinguish between those and end up better understanding and fighting for, almost in my mind now, hearing you say it that way, it's almost a nice hybrid of equality and liberation then, because
Yeah.
what it ends up doing is helping us understand in a deeper way than maybe we've ever had to before, what equality looks like and means, and from what specifically can we be liberated from, what constraints can be lifted off. Can't lift off the constraints of the female reproductive role in the
No.
species, but you can lift up material constraints that are imposed because
Yeah.
we have that evolutionary burden, right? And so we can
Yeah.
start working through that and understanding, what that looks like for women, in a way that I don't think we've ever had to before. And thank goodness, by the way, that we didn't go through with the ERA, because we would find ourselves in quite a wreck right now if it were constitutionally enshrined, that all that matters to women, and how we flourish and how we do in society, that all that ever matters is strict equality, because that's all the ERA is strict
Yeah.
equality.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't I've read about it, but I don't know enough about it, but I've heard that critique as well, and I think it's accurate. Uh wow. Just to say thank you all, everyone who has been here with us today. And I don't know if anyone wants to put up any last minute questions. I feel our conversation is winding down, but I know we still have a number of viewers. So I haven't really put up any questions because the conversation has been flowing so well. But if anyone has a question that you want to put up, I will be happy to pose it to Candice. And I don't know, Candice, is there any last thing that you want to say? Obviously you are doing this work with Wolf. So I know that Wolf itself, this is the Women's Liberation Front, can absolutely accept support. So if you want to support this lawsuit against the women's prisons, you can donate to Wolf. But I don't know, is there anything you want to add that I haven't got to that I didn't point out, or something that you think is important for women to know or assert when they're having these conversations?
I do think that, everybody who hasn't yet taken a look at the Women's Bill of Rights that's out there being actively supported by WDI, US, Wolf, and then also a lot of groups that are concerned about women that are right of center. And when you look at that, the ability for women, I think that's a great roadmap to help have these conversations in real life, because it reads very common sense. It reads very balanced in terms of, all we're talking about is keeping that line of material reality, and making sure that words refer to women, tying us back to the reality of belonging to the female sex class, and then starting and how that has to play out, because you talk about equality, but you can't have equality by pretending that material differences don't exist. That would be like saying, that would be like saying that for people with disabilities to have full participation in our society, that all we need is to treat a person with a disability exactly the same as others who don't have that disability. That's not meaningful opportunity to fully participate in society. That's a characteristic that requires going that step beyond and recognizing the difference, and then seeing how to reasonably accommodate that difference.
Yeah. And, this is really why, I mean, those of you who follow me, this is why I am an absolute hardliner on this issue of embodiment and recognizing our, fully embodied, fully sexed, whole humanity. I will never go along with these pronouns for politeness or for any other reason, because these are they are detrimental to women and our material, our ability to analyze our material conditions, and they are ultimately a form of gaslighting and grooming, and harmful to kids, because they preach. I love that you have continued to refer to this as an ideological position, because this position preaches into the world a dissociative state and a dissociative mindset and a cognitive dissonance that I always have to be in participation with. And the fact of the matter is, I refuse participation. I don't want to participate in my own dissociation. So I don't dissociate from what my eyes see and my ears hear and my senses tell me. I name reality, and I think that the work that you're doing is so essential, because first of all, this lawsuit specifically is about the most marginalized women out there. These are women who traditionally do not have a voice. So I thank Wolf, and I thank organizations like Keep Women's Prison Single Sex, because these these women are the most vulnerable, and they need someone.
I mean, the credit is to these women themselves, that it's not easy for them to do this. I mean, when you think of living day in, day out with these men, and now being known and having been willing to put their names on a legal challenge to what's going on. I mean,
I can't even imagine. I mean, I don't even like talking to them online. I block the moment someone is, I'll engage with earnest questions, but the absolute moment someone, gets insulting, gets rude, I'm just on an immediate block policy. I get to just block them and move forward. And
that
as you said,
that is a privilege we have, that these women in prison obviously do not. And that's it makes it very easy for those of us on the outside like that to fight for them, because what they're going through is unimaginably, they're paying a higher price than any of us are trying to fight for them.
Absolutely insane. Well, thank you, Candice, so very much for having this conversation with me. I have absolutely learned things. I always think like, oh, I know everything. I'm, I've researched. I've been working on this issue for so long, but I absolutely learned things, and I so appreciate your time. I so appreciate your work. I really appreciate getting into more of the nitty gritty about Title IX and how it actually functions and how it is functioning within this ideology. So I really appreciate it. And I know that I will see you again in our spaces and meet you out in the world sometime soon, I hope.
Oh, that is all mutual feeling on my part. Thank you very much.
All right. And thank you everyone for tuning in with us today. This will be up on my YouTube. I don't think I put in a wolf link, but I'll put a wolf link in the show notes
Great.
retrospectively. And Candice's bio is down there. You can also follow her on Twitter. Remind me your Twitter handle.
CE Jackson Law.
CE Jackson Law. I'll put that in the show notes as well. So you guys can find this. This will be up on my YouTube immediately. And thank you all for tuning in today. And thank you, Candice.
Thanks, Amy.